Hello, everyone. Today, we're going to be going over question 5 of the final exam, which has to do with hashing. And for part A, suppose we have the dog class below. So let's actually take a look at the dog class before we go into the questions. And for the dog class, we see here that we have a large list of variables that the dog class is part of. You have a static integer called docs created, which is initialized to 0. And then you have a private instance integer variable, which is age. You have a private final instance integer, which is microchip ID. You have a public instance variable string called name. And then you have another public instance variable string called owner. And then in the dog constructor, we have the following. We see that whenever the dog constructor is called, we increment dogs created by 1. We set age, name, and owner to the age, name, and owner that was passed in the parameters. And then you have this microchip ID set to dogs created. And after we set it, that doesn't change since it is a final variable. And then we have another method called birthday, which simply increments the age by 1. And then you have the following equals method and hash code method. They both override the superclass, which is the object class. And for the equals object, we have the following. We test whether O, the object that was passed into the equals method, we check if that is an instance of dog. And if it is, we cast it, as you can see here. And then what happens is after we cast it, we then check to see if the name is equal to the other dot name. And then we check if the microchip ID is equal to other dot microchip ID. And then we have a hash code here, which, as you can tell, we are going to be finding a function for. So let's take a look at this. For each of the following implementations of the dog hash code method, determine if it is good and valid, bad but valid, or invalid. So let's take a look at part 1, which in this case has a hash code that returns this age. Yeah, it returns this age. And if you take a look at the equals method, as you can see here, we have this the only instance variables that are tested in the equals method are name and microchip ID. Age is not part of this equals method, and therefore we cannot use the age as a way of determining in the hash code, because let's say if we were to have 2 equal dog objects, they would also have to have the same hash code. This age does not. If we have this age, it doesn't guarantee that. So therefore, this is an invalid hash code. There we go. And then for part 2, you have public int hash code return this microchip ID. This, if we look at the equals method, as you can see, as I said earlier, the only instance variables that are being tested in the equals method are the name and the microchip ID. And the microchip ID is actually present. And so as a result, this is a valid hash code, because the equals method tests the variable that we're looking at here, the microchip ID. Now, is this a good hash code or a bad hash code? This is actually what can be considered a good hash code, given the fact that there is a very large range of numbers that microchip ID can be. And let's say if we were to use a data structure that utilizes hashing, we could prevent these long bucket chains and instead have proper hashes. And so as a result, this would be good and valid. And then we have public int hash code. Return this .name.char at 0, but cast it to an integer. Now, if we look at the equals method, as I said again, the equals method does test the name and the microchip ID. And because we are working with something that has to do with the name, as a result, it can be a valid hash code. Now, that being said, now we need to check whether if it is a good hash code or a bad hash code. This leans more toward a bad hash code, given the fact that there is a very limited amount of characters then transformed into integers in comparison to like the microchip ID, which is a very large range of numbers. The amount of characters that we're using here is very limited in comparison to the microchip ID. So therefore, you could consider it to be a bad but valid hash code. And then finally, we have this.owner.hashcode. Upon looking at it, it seems good because if the owners are the same, then therefore they possibly could have the same hash code for two different dog objects. But that being said, if you look at the equals method here, remember that again, we're only testing the name object and the microchip ID object. And because the owner is not tested in this equals method, as a result, this cannot be a valid hash code. And it is therefore invalid.